Every morning at exactly 6:42, the wild lynx sat by her window. No leash, no name, no sound, just amber eyes watching from the tree line. For months, she thought it was coincidence. Curiosity. But then one snowy morning, it arrived with something in its mouth. Not prey. Not food. Something far more human. What started as a quiet ritual turned into a life-or-death race against nature, betrayal, and time. And when the truth was finally revealed, everyone who heard the story would never see wild animals the same way again. Stay close. This isn't what you think. The window visitor. The morning light filtered through the pine trees like golden smoke, dancing across the frost-laced glass of the studio window. Sierra Morgan sat in her favorite chair, a chipped enamel mug of black coffee nestled between her palms, the steam rising to kiss her tired face. It was the third week of November in Juneau, Alaska. The air outside was brittle, edged with silence. And then she saw it, again. There, just beyond the edge of the forest that cradled her small log cabin, sat the lynx. Its thick, silver-gray coat shimmered like moonlight, marked with faint charcoal rosettes that gave it the look of a ghost emerging from the timber. Tufted ears flicked with precision. Its golden eyes were steady, intelligent, unblinking. Its tail, comically short and tipped in black, twitched just once. Sierra didn't move. She had spotted it for the first time nearly a month ago. Back then, she had assumed it was just passing through, maybe chasing snowshoe hares or scouting her compost bin. But it had come back. Again. And again. Always at the same time. Always alone. And always, just watching. She didn't feed it. She didn't speak to it. She simply sipped her coffee, heart beating just a bit faster than normal, and stared back. Something about the lynx unsettled her, not with fear, but familiarity. The creature was wild, undoubtedly. But it wasn't afraid. And neither somehow was she. Sierra returned to her easel, brush in hand. Her canvas, still half blank, was filled only with the outline of an animal. The stroke of its back, the rise of its cheek, the tilt of its ears, those were certain. But the eyes? She hadn't gotten them right. Not yet. She glanced at the window again. The lynx hadn't moved. It sat like a sculpture carved from snow and instinct. Something in that stillness made her chest ache. Not out of danger, but recognition. She'd lived in this cabin for just over a year, ever since leaving Anchorage and the noise of everything she didn't want to remember. The accident. The broken engagement. The months of guilt that followed her like a shadow through every grocery aisle, every voicemail she deleted without listening. But here, with no cell service and no neighbors within miles, she found a kind of silence she could survive. Except now, she wasn't entirely alone. Over time, she began painting it, not from photographs, but from memory. She named it in her mind, though never out loud, the Watcher. Still, she never tried to tame it. That would have been a violation of something sacred. Instead, they entered a kind of silent agreement. Each morning, Sierra would rise, brew her coffee, and sit in the same chair. And each morning, the lynx would return, settling in the shadows of the spruce grove outside her window, watching her without asking for anything. She didn't need to speak. And it didn't need to stay. But somehow, both of them did. Until the morning it brought something in its mouth. Something that would unravel everything Sierra thought she knew, about wild animals, about herself, and about what it truly means to be chosen. A dangerous beginning. The first sound was so soft, Sierra thought it was a dream. A faint scratching. Then a low, rhythmic thump. She stirred under her flannel blanket, eyelids heavy, the morning sun not yet risen. But the sound came again, sharper this time, closer. Knock. Scratch. Knock. She sat up abruptly, breath fogging in the cold cabin air. The fire had died overnight, and her fingers ached from the chill as she reached for the wool cardigan draped over the foot of the bed. It was still dark. Her feet padded quietly over the worn floorboards to the back door, where the noise was now unmistakable. Not a person. Not wind. She flicked on the porch light. And there it was. The lynx. It was standing not by the woods like usual, but at her back door, just feet from her. Its breath steamed visibly in the frigid air, its body tense and alert. Paws scratched again at the door, but not like an animal trying to get in. More like a signal. A warning. Sierra's heart kicked. "What the hell?" she whispered. The lynx backed up a step, then looked toward the mountain, toward the road that wound through the trees above her property. And that's when she heard it. A deep, rolling rumble, low and terrible, like thunder being dragged across the ground. Everything around her seemed to go still. Even the wind paused. Then the sound grew louder, closer. Snow. No, a wall of snow. The avalanche hit the mountainside with an unholy roar. Through the trees, a blur of white roared downward, sweeping rocks, branches, and ice in its path. Sierra didn't think. She turned, bolting for the front of the cabin, grabbing her radio as she passed. No signal. Of course. The earth shook beneath her boots. Windows rattled. The snow wasn't aimed at her cabin, it would just miss it, but the only road out? Gone. She could already imagine it, buried, twisted with fallen trees, completely cut off. She stumbled back to the porch. The lynx was gone. She scanned the yard, spinning, panic clawing at her chest, until she spotted it at the edge of the clearing, halfway to the forest. It turned to look at her once, eyes burning gold in the gray light of dawn. And then it disappeared into the trees. She collapsed onto the step, heart pounding in her throat. The whole thing had lasted seconds. But she understood what she had just witnessed. That lynx, wild, silent, unpredictable, had come not for food, not for warmth. It had come to warn her. She could have been walking her usual morning path up the ridge. Could have been sketching near the old logging trail. She would have never seen it coming. But the lynx had known. And it had come to her. In the deafening silence that followed, Sierra realized something had shifted, not just in the mountain, but in her world. Whatever fragile boundary had once existed between her and the lynx, it was gone now. It wasn't just watching her anymore. It was protecting her. And that was only the beginning. The morning sky over Juneau was stained in strange colors, dusty orange mixed with ash-gray clouds, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. Sierra stood in the middle of her snow-covered yard, still barefoot inside her boots, staring at the slope beyond the tree line where the avalanche had torn through like a god's fist. Branches lay snapped, a few trees splintered like matchsticks. The access road she used every few days to get supplies from town, gone. Just a mangled mess of debris beneath what had to be 6 feet of heavy snow. She wrapped her parka tighter around herself. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was isolation. Real isolation. Her satellite radio remained stubbornly silent. The storm 2 days ago had damaged her external antenna, and she hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Now the only way she could reach civilization was snowshoeing overland through the woods, if the terrain hadn't been turned into a minefield of unstable snow. Her body trembled from cold and adrenaline. Not from fear, not exactly. From awe. The lynx had come before the avalanche. Had stood at her door like it knew. That wasn't normal. That wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Sierra wasn't the kind of person to anthropomorphize animals. She'd spent too much time sketching from real-life observation to indulge in fairy tales. Nature was wild, unpredictable, beautiful, but it wasn't sentimental. Still. The image wouldn't leave her mind, those eyes, those paws scratching against the door, not like an intruder, but like someone knocking to say run. She returned inside and poured the rest of her lukewarm coffee down the drain. The taste had turned to ash in her mouth. By noon, she had gathered what supplies she could, a backup generator, a battery-powered scanner, her trail map. She didn't have enough food to last more than 2 weeks, 3 if she rationed and didn't get snowed in further. The nearest ranger station was 10 miles east, but that route crossed the same ridge where the avalanche had started. For the first time in months, Sierra felt the gravity of her solitude. This wasn't just about being alone anymore. This was about survival. She glanced out the window again. The lynx was gone, of course. It hadn't returned after vanishing into the forest. But somehow, she didn't feel abandoned. Something had shifted between them. A thread had been spun. Fragile. Invisible. But undeniably real. She didn't understand it yet. But she would. Soon. Uneasy friends. Sierra awoke the next morning before sunrise, though sleep had been nearly impossible. Her body ached from tension, and her mind refused to release the image of the lynx at her door, the pounding avalanche, and the terrible silence that followed. Still wearing thermal leggings and a thick wool sweater, She shuffled into the kitchen and lit the stove manually. The smell of percolating coffee was the only thing anchoring her to normalcy. But even that comfort was interrupted when she glanced out the frosted window. There it was again. The lynx. Sitting at the edge of the clearing, right beneath the skeletal outline of a fir tree coated in snow. It wasn't the same as before, there was something different in its posture. Less observational. More waiting. Sierra stood still, the mug in her hand warming her fingers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall. After several minutes, she grabbed a slab of leftover venison from the fridge, scraps from the stew she had planned to make, and stepped cautiously out onto the porch. Her boots crunched softly in the snow, and the air bit at her cheeks with sharp clarity. She didn't walk toward the lynx. She didn't need to. Instead, she knelt halfway between the porch and the tree-lean, set the meat on the snow, and slowly backed away. The lynx didn't budge. Its eyes followed her, unmoving. Only after she had returned inside and closed the door did it rise, padded forward with eerie grace, and inspect the offering. Sierra watched, her breath caught in her throat. The lynx sniffed the meat, then delicately picked it up, carried it a few paces back toward the trees, and ate. Not in a frenzy. Not like a starving animal. But with intent. And when it was done, it sat there again. Like it belonged. That became their routine. Day after day, she left small pieces of food, carefully measured, not too close to the cabin, and the lynx returned, accepted, and lingered. It never growled. Never approached aggressively. But neither did it flee. By the end of the week, it sat just 20 feet from her porch. Sierra began to sketch again. Not from imagination, but from presence. Each line on the page captured its symmetry, its stillness. The tufted ears like soft daggers. The ruff of winter fur around its neck, thicker than she'd realized. The long, lean legs built for snowbound silence. And those eyes, amber, endless, aware. She didn't speak to it, not often. Just a quiet word now and then. A murmur of good morning or you again, half laughing at herself for narrating to a wild animal. But it was becoming something more than habit. It was becoming a thread of comfort in the storm of her isolation. Until the neighbor ruined it. Sierra had barely seen another human in 6 months, but that morning, the crunch of unfamiliar boots on the drive made her heart stutter. Doug Ramsey. He lived 2 ridges over. A retired wildlife trapper with a loud voice and a louder ego. She'd met him once at the gas station. He had offered her a real gun for protection, and she had politely declined. Now he stood in her yard, arms crossed, staring toward the woods where the lynx had just disappeared. "You feeding that thing?" he asked, suspicion thick in his voice. Sierra met his gaze, careful not to show surprise. "No," she lied smoothly. Doug's eyes narrowed. "Trail cam picked up its tracks circling my shed. Got a dead hare out back yesterday. Lynx'll start hunting pets next." "I don't have pets," Sierra replied. He studied her a beat too long. "Just keep in mind," he muttered, turning to leave, "a wild animal that gets too comfortable with people stops being wild. Then it starts being dangerous." The warning sat with her long after he was gone. But when she looked out the window again and saw those golden eyes watching her, she knew. Danger hadn't come from the lynx. It had just walked away in human boots. The air felt different after Doug's visit. Not colder, just heavier. Sierra stood by her window that evening, a steaming mug in her hands, watching the snow fall in slow spirals beyond the glass. The lynx had returned just before sunset, silent as ever, and lingered near the spruce for nearly an hour. But it hadn't approached the spot where she usually left food. Not tonight. She didn't blame it. Something had shifted. Doug's words echoed in her ears like sleet tapping the roof. "It starts being dangerous." She didn't believe that. Not about the lynx. Not after what it had done. But she knew the consequences if the wrong people believed it. Doug had seen the lynx as a threat the moment it crossed an invisible boundary, stepping out of the forest and too close to a world fenced in by property lines and fear. The next day, Sierra found a motion-activated trail camera mounted to a tree near the base of her driveway. She almost missed it, well hidden in the crook of the trunk, angled low toward the path the lynx used to come and go. Doug. She stared at it for a long moment, heart hammering. Then she turned, stomped back to the cabin, and slammed the door behind her. She didn't touch the camera. Not yet. She needed to think. The storm that had been brewing all week finally rolled in that night. Winds that howled through the trees like a grieving choir, snow falling in heavy clumps. By dawn, everything was buried in 2 feet of powder, and the forest looked like another planet. She didn't see the lynx that morning. Or the next. Her chest ached with a dull sense of absence, like she'd forgotten something important but couldn't name it. She waited by the window longer than usual. Sketched without focus. Boiled soup she didn't feel like eating. 3 days passed. Nothing. And then, just after noon on the 4th day, she heard something outside. Not the deliberate grace of Paws, but the sharp rustling of boots. Sierra stepped onto the porch, scarf pulled tight around her chin. Doug stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle slung over his shoulder, staring into the trees. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. He turned, unfazed. "Following fresh tracks." "Are you serious?" She took a step forward. "In a blizzard?" "Not just any tracks," he said. "Your lynx left prints right by my chicken coop this morning. I've got the footage." "It's not my lynx," she snapped. He raised a brow, as if to say, "Isn't it?" "I've reported it," he added. "Fish and Game's coming up next week to investigate. If that thing gets too close again, it'll be put down. You've been warned." Sierra didn't reply. Not right away. Because she knew exactly what Doug was doing. Not protecting his property. Not really. He was drawing a line in the snow, between wild and tame, between acceptable and outlaw. And she had been standing on the wrong side of that line ever since the lynx showed up. As Doug turned and disappeared into the white woods, she looked out over the clearing. The lynx hadn't come back. But it was still watching. Somewhere. And now, it wasn't just survival that was at stake. It was trust. Between a woman, a wild animal, and a world that didn't believe in either. The morning gift. The morning broke quietly, as if the storm from the past week had taken every sound with it. Pale light stretched across the forest floor, filtering through the tall spruce and hemlocks, and Sierra stepped onto her porch with her sketchpad tucked under her arm. Her boots crunched softly on the frost-crusted boards, breath curling in front of her lips like smoke. It had been over a week since she'd last seen the lynx. She told herself it was natural. Lynx were solitary, elusive by nature, but her chest ached in that quiet, gnawing way that only missing something unspoken can bring. She turned to go back inside. And then she saw it. The lynx stood just beyond the porch, less than 10 yards away. But something was different. It wasn't sitting like it usually did. It wasn't calm or distant. It was pacing. Circling a small mound on the ground, tail twitching, ears pinned forward with purpose. Sierra froze. Her eyes dropped to the snow in front of the animal. At first, she thought it had killed something, a rabbit maybe, or a hare. But as she stepped closer, the shape became clearer. It wasn't prey. It was a tiny bundle. Fur matted with frost. Legs trembling. A kitten. No, not wild. This wasn't a bobcat or lynx cub. It was domestic. Small, soot gray with a white streak across its cheek. Barely breathing. Sierra dropped her sketchpad. The lynx backed away a few steps, eyes fixed on her, but made no sound. It stood like a sentinel, allowing her to approach. Sierra knelt slowly, her breath catching. The kitten was ice cold, but alive. Limp, but not yet gone. "Oh my God," she whispered, wrapping it in her scarf. Its heartbeat fluttered against her palm like a hummingbird's wing. "Where did you find it?" The lynx didn't move. She looked back at the cat's tiny form. No collar, no tag. Just a single jagged tear across its back leg, maybe from barbed wire, maybe worse. Sierra rose to her feet and glanced toward the tree-line. "Did you bring this here?" The lynx blinked slowly, then turned and walked away. Not rushed. Not afraid. As if its job was done. Inside, Sierra moved fast. She lit the stove, warmed a towel, boiled water for a makeshift heating pad, and found the emergency pet formula she hadn't used since bottle feeding a rescue squirrel 5 years ago. The kitten barely stirred, but it drank, just enough. Enough to give her hope. She wrapped it in a wool sweater and held it close to her chest, rocking gently. Outside the window, the forest remained still. But Sierra could feel it. Somewhere out there, the lynx was watching. And the line between predator and protector had never felt so beautifully blurred. The morning gift. Sierra didn't sleep that night. She lay on the couch, the tiny kitten tucked inside a fleece-lined shoebox near the fireplace, its breathing shallow but steady. Every few hours she fed it drops of warm formula and rubbed its belly gently to coax movement. Its leg had swollen around the gash, but there was no sign of broken bone, at least none she could feel. The cabin, usually so still, felt charged with meaning. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the windows seemed louder, more alive. She couldn't stop thinking about the lynx. Why had it brought the kitten? Was it chance? Had the wild creature mistaken the bundle for prey, only to discover its fragility and changed its mind? No. That didn't sit right. There had been too much purpose in the way it stood. Too much intention in the moment it allowed her close. By morning, Sierra knew she needed help. She bundled the kitten in a basket lined with towels, packed her snowshoes, and set out toward the neighboring ridge where she knew Doug Ramsey had a working radio. She hated the idea, but the kitten needed antibiotics, and fast. The hike was grueling. Ice crunched beneath her steps, the forest eerily silent in the aftermath of the storm. Branches drooped low with heavy snow, and the path curved sharply along the frozen streambed. She reached Doug's cabin just before noon. When he opened the door, surprise flickered in his eyes. Then wariness. "Didn't expect to see you," he muttered. "I need your radio," Sierra said, breathless. "There's a kitten, hurt. I think it's from your property." Doug's brow furrowed as she opened the basket. He stared at the kitten for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, recognition. "That's Maggie's," he said slowly. "Barn cat had a litter last month. One went missing during the storm." He crouched beside the basket, his voice softer now. "Where'd you find her?" Sierra hesitated, then told him. The lynx. The porch. The delivery. Doug listened without interrupting. No sarcasm. No scoffing. Just silence. When she finished, he stood up and walked to the radio, calling in a vet tech who serviced remote properties. "She'll be here by sunset," he said quietly. "I'll cover the call." Sierra blinked. "Why?" He looked at her, eyes tired but honest. "Because if what you said is true, that lynx may have done more good than most folks I know." They stood in the doorway together as the wind picked up again. Sierra held the basket closer, the kitten shifting slightly inside. Alive. Safe. Out in the woods, hidden beyond trees and mistrust, a wild creature had made a choice. Not out of instinct, but something far harder to explain. And now, even the people who once feared it were beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the wild had more to teach them than they thought. Where the smoke meets the river. It started with the wind. Not the soft rustling kind that stirred pine needles, but a dry, erratic current that whipped through the forest like a restless spirit. Branches groaned. Leaves trembled. Birds stopped singing. Sierra stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the clouds roll in from the west like bruises spreading across the sky. A thunderstorm had been forecast for the valley that week, but nothing prepared her for what came next. The flash was so fast she didn't see it, only the brilliant afterglow that seared through her vision, followed by the crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath her boots. Then the smell. Not just ozone, but burning. Something had been hit. By the time she spotted the column of smoke rising beyond the ridge, it was already too late. A spruce tree, tall and dry, had been split by the bolt and ignited instantly. Now, in the thick of a snow-thawed forest littered with brittle undergrowth, the fire had space to move. Fast. Sierra ran inside, tossing essentials into a rucksack, emergency water, map, the kitten now stronger but still weak. She radioed in the fire's coordinates to the emergency dispatcher, then paused. One name echoed in her mind, but it wasn't human. The lynx. She hadn't seen it since the morning it delivered the kitten. No prints, no sign. But she felt its presence, out there among the trees, somewhere in the direction of the rising smoke. The fire wouldn't reach her cabin for hours, if it curved west. But if it ran downhill, everything in its path was vulnerable. She strapped on her snowshoes, slung the pack across her shoulder, and ran toward the river path. Not away from the fire. Toward it. Because if that lynx was out there, it didn't know what was coming. And she owed it everything. The air thickened with every step. Sierra's lungs burned as she descended into the lower basin, the acrid scent of smoke mixing with pine sap and scorched earth. Flames crackled somewhere in the distance, a haunting roar beneath the trees. Visibility dropped fast. A smoky haze clung to the ground, casting a red glow over the snow like the world had been dipped in ash. She reached the bend in the river and froze. There, barely visible through the haze, was the lynx. It stood on a rocky outcrop, cornered by a ring of encroaching flame. Its fur bristled, ears flat, eyes wild with fear but not panic. The heat was blistering. Sierra didn't think. She kicked off her snowshoes, sprinted forward, and pulled the fire blanket from her pack. The smoke stung her eyes as she climbed up the slope, slipping once on wet rock. "Hey!" she shouted hoarsely. "Come on, move." The lynx turned to face her, frozen between fight and flight. She opened the blanket wide, crouched low, and edged forward, slow, steady, deliberate. Her heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But she didn't. She kept her gaze low, body small. The lynx took one step forward. Then another. And then, with a grace that didn't feel real, it moved toward her, close enough for the heat of its breath to meet hers. Sierra dropped the blanket gently over both of them and turned, guiding the creature down the path, out of the smoke, toward the rushing river and safety. They made it out just as the fire line broke past the ridge behind them, flames licking at the path like a beast enraged at being denied its prize. By the time they reached the clearing beyond the river, the lynx stopped. It shook off the blanket, turned once to look at her, long and deep, then vanished into the trees. Sierra collapsed to her knees, coughing, laughing, crying all at once. She hadn't just rescued a wild animal. She had repaid a debt. And somewhere in the burning silence of the forest, a bond had been burned into permanence. One built not on taming, but on trust. Through the glass. The fire took 3 days to contain. A crew of 20 worked around the clock, dropping suppressant from above and digging trenches around the valley's edge. Sierra stayed with a ranger family down in the town center, her kitten curled against her chest like a beating ember that never stopped pulsing. She didn't say much to anyone about what had happened. Not at first. Because how do you explain a moment like that? How do you put into words what it feels like to watch a wild creature trust you with its life? She returned to her cabin a week later. The trail home was scarred, charred bark, blackened snow, the smell of smoke soaked deep into the earth. But the cabin still stood. Her home had survived. The first thing she did was stand by the window. The same window where it all began. It was quiet. No lynx. No pawprints in the snow. Just the wind brushing the trees, like a breath held and released. Days passed. Sierra unpacked slowly, carefully placing her sketch pads in a fresh box labeled Winter with her. She didn't paint the lynx again. She didn't need to. The image lived behind her eyes now, etched in her chest like stone warmed by fire. Her story spread faster than she imagined. The rescue of the kitten. The avalanche. Even the fire. Her sketches went viral when a ranger shared them online. Offers came in, a publishing deal, a gallery showcase, a wildlife nonprofit asking for her designs on an education campaign about predator awareness and coexistence. But none of that mattered when the morning came that she looked out and saw it again. The lynx. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 small shadows trailed behind her, kittens, maybe 10 weeks old, mimicking their mother's every step. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The lynx turned, eyes meeting Sierra's through the glass, just for a moment. Then she led her young ones back into the forest. No closer. No farewell. Just a glimpse. A gift. Sierra stood by the window long after they disappeared. Some bonds don't need to be spoken to be understood. And some mornings, just a few, just enough, change your life forever. She had waited, watched, and been chosen in return. By something wild. By something real. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, the wild doesn't need to roar to be heard, it just needs to be seen. In a world that often teaches us to fear what we don't understand, this story reminds us that trust, empathy, and quiet observation can build bridges even where language cannot. The bond between Sierra and the lynx was never about ownership or control. It was about respect. About showing up, morning after morning, not asking for anything, just being there. And sometimes that's all we really need, from each other, from nature, from life. So ask yourself, what would happen if, instead of taming the unknown, you let it teach you something? What if the things that scare us the most are just trying to offer us something fragile, beautiful, and alive? Here at Paw Print Stories, we believe the smallest encounters can lead to the deepest changes. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to stay with us. More tales of unexpected friendships are waiting to be discovered. Now here's your challenge. Next time something wild crosses your path, pause, watch, and ask yourself, is this a warning or a gift?